16-bit console wars were in the rear view. Companies move on to the next stage, the next gen stage. As with the Genesis, Sega would start first.
In May of 1995, Sega released the Sega Saturn. This 32-bit system was more powerful than anything that had been released before it. Sega decided to abandon cartridges due to the fact that CD-ROM technology was already mainstream and could hold a ton more data than a cartridge. On the technical side of things, the system sported two Hitachi Super H2 32-bit processors and a custom Yamaha sound processor. Sega learned how important audio was in the gaming market, due largely to the fact that a lot of consumers claimed to prefer SNES titles over Genesis ones, due to the sound quality. With Nintendo's new system struggling to get past the developmental phase, Sega would have close to a full year advantage to control the market. The formula was perfect. All Sega had to do was kick back and watch the numbers roll in. However, by late 1995 going into 1996, Sega was anything but dominant. In fact, Sega was struggling.
How could this be? How could Sega's brilliant plan be laid to waste? The answer to this question lies in a sour business deal made by Nintendo.
You see, shortly after Nintendo caught wind of Sega developing a CD-ROM for the Genesis, they felt the technology would hit big. Not wanting to be left in the dark, they expressed interest in developing a CD drive for the SNES. Multiple companies were competing to be the ones to develop the new SNES CD drive, until Ken Kutaragi of Sony convinced Nintendo that the Sony SPC 700 processor was the perfect match for the technology already existing in the SNES. A partnership was born, and Sony would begin development immediately on this new piece of hardware for the SNES.
Things were set in motion, and Sony acted fast, producing a CD drive not only to rival, but exceed that of the Sega Genesis.
But due to contract issues and the Sega CD not receiving a warm reception, Nintendo pulled out of the deal last minute. Sony had already invested in the SNES add-on and was now left with a rumored few hundred useless units. Outraged and not wanting to take a financial loss, Sony realized that while making the failed add-on for the Super Nintendo, they had acquired enough know-how to possibly make their own console. And in September of 1995, they did just that when they released the Sony PlayStation. A 32-bit system, just like the Saturn, Sony's system was a radical leap forward and offered something consumers hadn't seen before. The biggest issue gamers had with the Sega Saturn is that although claiming to be a next-generation system, the Saturn games felt dated and played just like Genesis games. Sony, on the other hand, had tremendous third-party support, and its games right at launch felt like something a next-gen console should play.
This alone steered a lot of people away from Sega and into the welcoming arms of Sony. By mid-1996, Sega and Sony were neck and neck, but things were about to get really interesting, as Nintendo was months away from entering the mix.
And in late September of 1996, Nintendo released the Nintendo 64. Unlike the PlayStation and Saturn, the N64 was a 64-bit gaming system, twice the output capacity of Sony and Sega. Also, unlike the PlayStation and Saturn, Nintendo decided to stick with cartridges opposed to CD-ROM. This limiting factor would play a role later on. The year the N64 released, it dominated, with almost every store selling out every freshly stocked inventory. Nintendo couldn't produce enough units fast enough. Within its first year selling close to 5 million units, it appeared Nintendo had taken its place as the king of the gaming industry.
With Nintendo re-establishing industry dominance, and the PlayStation having tremendous third-party support, Sega was pretty much down for the count. So the main event was set. It was going to be Nintendo and Sony in a heavyweight slugfest.
For the entire year of 1997, Nintendo dominated, with releases like Mario 64 and Star Fox 64, household names with next-gen gameplay. Consumers were loving it, but Sony was still in the fight with games like Twisted Metal, Tomb Raider, and Crash Bandicoot. Heading into late 1997, the holiday season was pivotal. It was a make-or-break situation for Sony, and what I like to call the winner of the RPG, Sony struck when SQUARESOFT released Final Fantasy VII, a true next-generation RPG on an epic scale.
Nintendo won that holiday season, but Final Fantasy VII showed developers and the world how epic a CD-ROM based game could be.
Going right into 1998, Capcom released Resident Evil 2. This game was a horror movie brought to a terrifying interactive life, and similar to Final Fantasy VII, showed how epic a game could be made using the advantage of CD-ROMs to continue a story. A CD-ROM drive made it possible to change discs without ever having to reset your game system, making developmental potential limitless for CD-ROM based game systems, whereas cartridges had storage limitations and no hot swapping capabilities. This gave third-party developers a ton more freedom with the PlayStation, and it showed. In all of 1998, when PlayStation's release schedule far exceeded that of the Nintendo 64. By late 1998, Sony had caught up to Nintendo.
Going into holiday season 1998, both companies knew this would more than likely be the final round. Sega, who had long given up on their Saturn, was already set to release their next generation system. Both companies were in a pinch and knew that this was the pivotal moment to make a final stand.
Holiday of 1998 saw the release of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, heralded by most as the best of the Zelda series and one of the greatest games ever made. Who better to push Nintendo past Sony than one of their top dog franchises? Nintendo had the big guns set. However, Sony was not ready to give up the slight advantage they had on Nintendo when Konami released Metal Gear Solid, the game that took action and interactive storytelling to new heights, and will be the model in which most modern games are built today. The new Zelda was great, but was not enough for Nintendo to take the lead. Metal Gear Solid showed how a next-gen action title should be played, and the PlayStation took off. It appears Nintendo's sour business deal had come back to haunt them.
In 1999, Nintendo tried multiple things to gain ground over Sony. Things like making a CD drive for the N64, and even porting over PlayStation games, which felt pretty much like cheap, watered-down versions. By mid-1999, Sega was set to kick off the next chapter in the console wars saga. So tune in next time, guys, when Sega and Nintendo duke it out with Sony over supremacy, and the death of an industry innovator would lead to the birth of a new standard in gaming. Until next time, this is Ness, signing out.